Good evening to our Flagstaff and broader community. We are excited to be joining you once again with another LBE topic. This is an interesting and exciting one as we talk about the librarian, Belle da Costa Greene, her story and the implications of her experience and what she lived and worked through. I am excited to join you all this evening and to engage in this conversation. And I'm thrilled to introduce you to a returning guest on our program, Dr. Natasha Howard, who is joining us to give our presentation, and then we'll engage in our Q&A time. Dr. Howard is a writer and researcher that educates and trains adults in the areas of race, gender, class, and sexuality with regard to communications, the media, and popular culture. As a speaker, she has presented her research at numerous national conferences, served on numerous panels, and been published in both academic and non-academic publications. Dr. Howard currently works in the Atlanta area where she is an assistant professor of communications at Morehouse College. Welcome, Dr. Howard.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. Um, okay, so yes, so today we are talking about Belle da Costa Greene, who was J.P. Morgan's librarian. She basically is the person who is behind purchasing and suggesting and basically helping him to build the large collection that he had of art and specifically in terms of manuscripts, original works. Just she's the woman basically behind that man, you could say. An interesting thing, which is basically the theme behind this presentation, is talking about who she actually was, because it wasn't until after her death it really became known that she is, in fact, a Black woman. And she came from a very prominent family, as a matter of fact, from the DC area. And so we're going to just really get a sense in terms of talking about her passing, and then just so many of the implications as they relate to her particular life. It's funny because there's this idea that she was hiding in plain sight, in a sense, because she was born in 1879 and she passed away in 1950. So she was living in the beginning of Jim Crow, which is going to be one of the things that I talk about. So to start, Belle da Costa Greene was born actually Belle Marion Greener in November 26, 1879. Although she often told people when asked that she was born, she would say Richmond or Alexandria, Virginia, or someplace in the South. She actually was raised for the first 9 years of her life in Washington, D.C., where generations of her family were based. To really get a good idea of who she was and perhaps get a sense of how she got to where she was, her mindset as it relates to passing, which is something she would never admit to, even on her deathbed, when there were questions and rumors swirling about, like, what her ancestry was. She never would actually publicly confirm or deny her actual ancestry. But to get a sense of who she was and the context of where she is from, we have to really talk about her parents. And so, although these are pictures of her when she was younger, but to set the scene, Belle's mother, Genevieve or Jeannie Fleet, came from a very prominent family in the Washington, D.C. area. As a matter of fact, they were a family that had been, during the time of slavery, they actually had been free for generations before the Civil War. In particular, her family lived in the Georgetown area of Washington, D.C. Her grandfather was a physician who had received medical training from the American Colonization Society. So basically, they were pretty prominent in the free people of color community. Her father was Richard Greener, who was the first Black graduate of Harvard College. He also went on to be very, very well known in both politics and in terms of working for civil rights issues. So while he was not from as prominent a family as his wife, he was also born free, and he was the descendant of race workers, and that his father worked with anti-slaver advocate and abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Both of her parents, similar to his wife, both of her father and her mother both had a very fair complexion. It's with pictures of him that are out, it's kind of hard to get a sense of his true complexion, but he was, the way people would describe him was that he was one shade darker than a white man, is the way they would describe him. Some of that because similar to her mother, there was of course mixed ancestry in the past. He particular had, he had a grandfather that was Spanish. And so as a result, both of them were pretty fair complexioned, and as were many of the people who they surrounded themselves with. The interesting thing in terms of Belle is that, you know, people often would wonder, like, where did she get this trend? Where did she get this interest in this, just her eye and her keenness and knowledge about art and literature and manuscripts and all of that. And it's very likely she got them from both of her parents. Her father, although he went into law and politics, he had a dream as a young man to be able to go to Europe and study art, which he never got the chance to, but Belle did. And her mother was a noted music teacher. She actually even was a principal for a period of time. And so both of them were educators, and there was always art and music going around in their house. So getting the sense of where she came from, enough cannot be said about what was going on during the time in which she was born. So during the era of Reconstruction, which she was born into, you had a time when, you know, Black people were voting, they were being elected to office, they were being put in positions that they may not have had the chance to have had otherwise. Her father is one example of that. He was actually the first president of the University of South Carolina for a brief period of time. They, shortly after the Civil War, they decided to open it for a brief amount of time to try and basically to integrate. And so he was basically there. He went from being librarian to like being the president of the university for a period of time. And in the midst of, with Reconstruction, something that was really important was that in 1870, Republican Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts introduced the Civil Rights Act as an amendment to a general amnesty bill for former Confederates. And so the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1875, guaranteed all citizens, regardless of color, access to accommodations, theaters, public schools, churches, and cemeteries. So it forbid the barring of any person from jury service on account of race, and basically provided that all lawsuits brought under the new law would be tried in federal, not state courts. So when the Civil Rights Act of 1875 came about, there was this hope that eventually Blacks would be able to be fully accepted into society with these freedoms. This act essentially affirmed this idea of equality of all men before the law, and it prohibited, in particular, racial discriminations in public places. And in this era, you had people from the community in which that Belle and her family were from, who really had this idea that because of more opportunities, and in particular because, you know, they were considered the elite Blacks, they had a closer proximity to the white community. There was this idea that eventually the race, or starting with them, would be assimilated into society. And so essentially they based their social standing on this close proximity to whiteness. And then there was this idea, you know, of course, of hope they would uplift the rest of the race. And so there were a lot of high hopes at this time. But unfortunately, this was very short-lived. In 1883, which was when Belle was about 4 years old, in a consolidated case before the Supreme Court known as the Civil Rights Cases, the court found that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution granted Congress the right to regulate the behavior of states, not individuals. And so basically, the court stated that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional and not authorized by the 13th or 14th Amendments of the Constitution. They stated Congress could not control private persons or corporations under the Equal Protection Clause. And effectively, in striking down the Civil Rights Act, they essentially, again, legitimized segregation, which essentially was the foreshadowing of Jim Crow laws, and also foreshadowed the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, and where the court found that separate but equal facilities for Blacks and whites were constitutional. So with this happening, this really changed a lot in terms of everyone, and it particularly affected even those in Belle's community. While life during Reconstruction was not perfect, there were still more opportunities available to Blacks during this time. And after the Supreme Court decision, when instead you had extreme cases of racism and violence that came along with Jim Crow, it became a bit of a shock, particularly, I would say, for people such as Belle's family, who, again, they really believed that eventually they were on their way to full assimilation and equality in society. And instead, with the opposite becoming the case, it definitely changed her trajectory and the family's trajectory. So basically, in the aftermath of this taking place, oh, went too far. I'm going to get to that. It was during this time, Belle was young, that her parents' marriage was already strained in the sense that her father traveled a lot, again, working with politics and the race issues. He was, after leaving the University of South Carolina, they returned to the Washington, D.C. area. And eventually, though, Mr. Greener found work in New York. And so when he was in New York, in the past, when he was traveling around Belle's mother and her siblings, she was one of 5 children. They basically would stay in DC. But when he went to New York, she decided to, Mrs. Greener, Belle's mother, decided to go to New York as well. And while they were there, that is when the issue of passing is what came into play. Essentially, when Belle's father came to New York, he was working for the Republican Party. And at the time, he was trying to distance himself from the civil rights, from the race work, basically, as he would call it at the time, for the cause of trying to, push politics, because it was believed that the Republican Party, which was, at that time still the party of Lincoln, were going to be the best advocates for Black people. And so while he was there, though, he also became secretary of the Ulysses S. Grant Monument Committee, basically in terms of working on getting a monument, which is coincidentally, he was working at the time with J.P. Morgan, who was treasurer on that same committee. But while he was there, for a short time, he was looking for work again, and he decided to make the decision to get back into race work. The issue that he faced was that was when the first questions and accusations of passing came into being. Because essentially, when he was trying to start again working for and doing race work, there were murmurings from the community they had left in DC that were saying that he had tried to pass and not been successful. And so now he was trying to return to the community. But the actual truth was, it was around that time, after they had moved to New York, that Belle's mother, actually, she was the genesis of her children, Belle included, of beginning to pass. Essentially, what the rumors was that once she came to New York, Belle's mother basically stopped associating with anyone that was not white. So she was still married to the father. He was still, again, well known for, again, even though he had very fair skin and at times had the ability, people may have mistaken him for being white, she in her social life only was around white people. And so as a result, these rumors started to circulate. Those actually hurt the father, Richard's, chances in terms of any politics. And a big piece in terms of it is, it's assumed that maybe her mother thought that because at the time, they were in New York, there was a lot of immigration coming from Europe and other countries to New York. So in a sense that they could sort of, even the neighborhood they lived in, they could sort of blend in with all these other newly arrived immigrants to the city. And so part of that is, they would be able to get better treatment because even though there were a lot of definitely it should be noted that at the time, not all the immigrants were being treated well. Definitely, there were different groups that were looked upon poorly, but of course, at that time, nobody was looked upon as poorly as Black people. And so the idea is that she was bit by bit, essentially trying to assimilate and pass, her and her family. For context, the big thing in terms of that is the fact that the society in which, Belle's family, her ancestry came from, they were expected to take pride in their racial ancestry. So despite any elitism, colorism, or any of that in that community, there was this idea that they were bringing up, that any accomplishments they made would bring up the entire race. And so as a result, it was really frowned upon to pass. And so that's part of the reason why, even being accused of that so negatively affected Belle's father, his political and work prospects, because that was heavily looked upon. There was the idea, regardless, that there still should be, at least to the outside world, a sense of unity in the Black community. So that's not to say that passing didn't take place, because I'm definitely, again, being considered being fair-skinned and being sometimes mistaken for being white. There were times like when Belle's father would be traveling, that he, not that he was trying to pass, but he wouldn't correct people in terms of like lodging or, travel accommodations, because of the fact that, he would be able to have better situation. He wasn't the only person who did things such as that. One example would be Walter White, who was of the NAACP. He often was known for using his fair complexion to his advantage during when he was traveling south during the 1920s to do research on lynchings in the KKK. He would be often mistaken for being a white man, and he would use that to his advantage for his research. But people did that from time to time. If they knew that if they were shopping, or if in any type of situation where they knew better treatment would be afforded, that would happen. But still, there was a difference between that and completely cutting yourself off from the community and deciding to pass. Essentially, the crowd they were in toted this idea of respectability being the key to equal rights. And so passing and just basically looking down, like leaving the complete community, that wasn't considered a good thing. So what is it that possibly led Belle's mother to basically make this decision? Because she didn't just make this decision for her, she made it for all of her children, Belle included. One could say it became clear that her marriage was falling apart, and seeing that she was alone with her children most of the time, and having to raise children on her own, that she could blend in, get better opportunities for her children if they were thought to be white. But one piece also could be this idea of the growing sentiment about what was considered Black. Belle's mother grew up at a time where she was identified as being a mulatto. And essentially that held a lot of weight, particularly in the Black community, in the sense that they distinguished themselves from other Blacks. It also even held weight in terms of when you think about with white people, because essentially it's like there was that layer between, they were almost like a buffer layer. They were looked upon as more favorably, if there's a thing, than they did other Blacks. And so after this Supreme Court decision, though, in 1883, there was an emphasis on keeping races separated. And so with that being in place, the idea of being a mulatto being different was gone. Anybody who had any connection to Blackness was considered to be Black. And actually, it really varied in terms of that extremity, depending on region. So essentially, this one diagram that you see in care of Dr. Yao Blay is essentially when you have this idea of a person, no matter if there's only one drop of Black blood in your ancestry, that person would be considered to be Black. At different times up until the 20th century, you had states like Indiana, Maryland, Missouri, Nebraska, North Carolina, North Dakota, and South Carolina, who all relied on this 1/8 rule, meaning if you had ancestry that went back to, like, you were 1/8 Black, then you in turn were defined as Black. You had other further states like in the South, like Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, et cetera, that said any blood of the African race would make a person be defined as Black. So the message essentially was that no matter how white you may appear, if there's one drop of Black blood in your lineage, you will be considered Black and treated accordingly. So essentially with this concept, it's like, even though, you could try and pretend, pass occasionally, being caught, there was danger attached to that. There was the idea, like, again, if you were to be caught passing, you didn't know what the circumstance would be. And at that point, any kind of link or any kind of connection to Blackness would have you be linked to Black. In particular, you had places like Virginia, where Belle came to be from, that went from defining Blackness as being a quarter of a more Black in 1904 to saying that any signs of Black ancestry made a person Black in 1924. So literally 20 years, they changed the definition of what made a person Black, because their idea was to try and keep there from being racial intermixing. So Dr. Yabableh said, in describing the one drop rule, that what really lay beneath the physical fears were their psychological ones. In order to maintain white supremacy, whiteness had to remain pure. So within this framework, Blackness was basically considered like a contaminant of the white race. And so which is why it really kind of explains the idea of why, for them, they thought that Blackness was inferior, which for a lot of ways is part of what made it people speculate even throughout Belle's life as to, what her ancestry was from, but nobody would ever out and out guess, because they couldn't fathom that this woman with such culture, such beauty, such knowledge, extreme knowledge of all the things that she had, could possibly be linked to this group of people who they looked down upon so much. So taking it back, Belle's mother did, bit by bit, again, she assimilated the family, basically increasingly passed. And by the time she divorced Belle's father, it was complete. In the 1900 census, Belle's mother stated that she was a widow, and Belle's passport applications from the 1910s also stated her father was deceased, despite the fact that he lived until 1922. They completely cut off at all aspects or mentions to her father and honestly their past, even in terms of public records. So in the census, they basically would have him as being dead, and they changed their name. So the interesting thing that's unique with Belle's family is that usually when they tell stories of passing, you hear about how the person has to leave behind all of their family, and they essentially are isolated as they're going about finding their new family and their new world as a white person. But in Belle's case, it was her mother and her 4 siblings. All of them essentially went along with the story of being white and lived that way till the day they died. There was never there aren't any traces of them ever speaking out or claiming their ancestry after they did make that decision. Another interesting thing about it is that the family they weren't consistent with their stories or the last names, because Belle's mother would often give different variations of her last name, from Genevieve Ida Fleet to Genevieve Greener to Genevieve Van Villay to Genevieve da Costa to Greene. Like they changed it depending on what the form was that they were doing. She and Belle, the way that Belle's name is spelled with da Costa is not the same as it's spelled in different forms. But at that time, because things were often with the census and those forms were done by hand, there was always the idea that perhaps somebody else made the error. So it basically kind of slid by. The story that they often would say, she would say that she attributed her olive skin and basically her features. She was considered to be, Yes. So here's a picture of her when she was working for JP Morgan. She was considered to be exotic. And so she attributed that to at first she said that it was due to Spanish ancestry, which was partly true. But eventually she would tell people that she had a Portuguese grandmother, which is where the da Costa came from. And again, it's an interesting thing about that, because, by passing themselves off as being part European, there were still groups that looked down upon certain groups of Europeans. But at the same time, that was still closer proximity to whiteness. And at the same time, the idea of what race was considered white was evolving, and it still was not Black. So it still served their purposes. But as a white woman, Belle went on to live a very full life. She attended Amherst College's Fletcher Summer Library School. She early on identified that she wanted to be a librarian. She loved early original manuscripts. She attended Teachers College. There are many people who would question how she gained her expertise in classic manuscripts. Some say attributed to the fact that she went on to become a librarian at Princeton University, and consistently she may have been attended lectures from different people who came to the university. She studied under different librarians at the time. She is actually she was never officially, though, trained in terms of being a librarian. They would say that she was probably one of the last generations for that to even be allowed to happen, because at the time there were some people who were being trained, but there were some people who could be librarians without that specific training. And instead were apprenticed. But she became a librarian at Princeton, and she helped her family essentially after I'll get to that point. Even though at the time the town of Princeton was considered to be, very discriminatory and segregated, because many of the students and faculty came from the South and brought those same ideas there. So many of the Blacks that lived in New Jersey did not necessarily look at Princeton the same way as Belle did. Nevertheless, she called it the most adorable spot in the world and continued to visit it throughout her life. She was trained and influenced, though, by Junius Morgan, who is J.P. Morgan's nephew. And it is actually through meeting him that she was introduced to J.P. Morgan, in the sense at that time he was beginning to put more emphasis on his art and manuscript collection. And Junius was very interested in art himself, and he basically sort of, by knowing her and knowing about her taste and influencing her, he was able to segue into her getting the job of his uncle's librarian. So as a way, he was able to exert his influence via her. But within a few years, so she met him in 1905 when she was 26, even though she would say that she was in her 20s, because she often would fabricate and lie about her age. Within a few years from that, she had grown close to Morgan, and she actually became one of his closest advisors. She would advise him. She even replaced Junius, the nephew, in terms of advising Morgan on manuscripts and items to purchase. There were those who speculated that maybe she was one of the many mistresses that J.P. Morgan had, but even though he was 40 years older than her, but both of them denied that frequently, but they were very, very close. And over these years, she grew to be the person. She was the main person, the point person. She would be sent to Europe to procure objects for the collection. She was, the main person. J.P. Morgan didn't like corresponding. He didn't like writing letters. So she would often be that middleman person in between everyone else, him and the outside world. So she was definitely very close with him. She grieved when he passed away. She also went on to be very close to his son, Jack, who took over for him at his passing. She had a very active social and love life. Despite having several affairs, she actually never married, and she never had children. The famed art curator and critic Bernard Berenson, who she had an affair and also was friends with for years, was who she considered to be the love of her life. But she never married. And, some part of it may be from some of the things that she'd written that she just didn't. She lived a sort of, they would say, bohemian life, in the sense that she believed in being able to have many lovers and be, free and not be married. But at the same time, there's also the idea that a lot of people who did pass, that would be like a moment, that'd be sort of a nervous moment, in the sense of not knowing how the children would come out. But then also the fact that many of the people she was intertwined with were often married. So she didn't, in terms of being respectable, did not want to be the person having a child out of wedlock. But amidst all of her travels, she took care of her family throughout her life. She often would tell people that her mother taught music to support her and her siblings, and that she was cultivated but impoverished, which was partly true because her mother did go back to work as a teacher after divorcing her father. But the minute that Belle became a librarian, she started off making $75 a month working with JP Morgan, which was a lot of money at that time, in the sense that her mother was able to retire after that, and Belle was able to help contribute to her siblings' schooling. Eventually, as her salary increased, she was one of the people, she helped put her brother through college, essentially, with the money that she made. So even as her family went on to, them individually getting their own careers and getting married, she still was probably the income that she made and the life she left. She was basically the stable one, the most stable and well-known person in her family. I would say, in the end, one wonders what to think of Ms. Greene. It's estimated that, thousands of mixed race people tried to pass as white, like her and her family, in response to segregation and racism. And had she not been in the world that she chose to work and socialize in, she was very well known in the New York social crowd, art scene, and also even in Europe through her travels. But had she not been as visible and known, it may not even been something that would have been noticed as much. But there were rumors throughout her life, and particularly as she inched to the end of her life, about her ancestry, because she was considered to look exotic. It's thought that JP Morgan actually did know the truth about her ancestry, just because one of his neighbors was the same person who wrote a letter on her behalf to get into a school, Northfield Seminary School for young ladies. And that particular neighbor happened to know her true ethnicity. So because that woman and JP Morgan ran in the same crowd and were actually neighbors, it's thought that, of course, that may have been passed on to him. But we don't know. Her lover, Bernard Berenson, himself guessed that she had Black ancestry, and she would actually poke fun at whenever somebody would make any kind of guesses that her ancestry was different than what she said. She would make jokes about it, basically trying to point to it like it was absurd, as though it would invalidate it. She definitely worked, I would say, to cover her tracks with it, in the sense that on the last year of her life in 1950, she burned all of her personal papers. Those things that are known about her life are basically from professional papers that she kept in terms of with the library, and from letters that those who knew her kept from her. She requested some of her friends would get rid of the letters that she had written them. So essentially she was trying to, even to the end, cover up any aspect, what could be known about her. It does make you wonder, like, would she be able to have had the life she did if she had not chosen to pass? At that time, again, racism was not even just racism was high, but even anti-Semitism. Jack Morgan, who she worked with, refused to work with Jewish dealers. So in her mind, it had to be like, well, if he's not going to even work with somebody who's Jewish, what will he do if he were to find out that I, have Black ancestry? So basically, and it wasn't even just for her own livelihood and the life that she desired, but again, she took care of her family. So it would have had a ripple effect if she was found out and she was fired, or any of those things happened. But at the end of her life, people, like I mentioned, did openly speculate about her ancestry. She would never admit to or cop to anything. All of her siblings continued. Those they married were also white, so they continued with that story, and they continued passing. So there was never anything officially by the family that came out and stated in terms of like that they were passing. That came out in terms of that, but and as a result, she to the end, she remained a mystery in some ways. She was known, but as one of her dear friends and protege, Dorothy Minor, said in a tribute to her, even those who felt that they were close to her felt like they never really knew her. She was a Black woman who lived her life as a white woman, and even then she would be known to use different racial slurs like many others of the day. She seemed to pay a lot of attention to the idea that she did have darker features in comparison to some of her siblings who had fairer skin. But she was a woman. She was essentially thought to be a woman of contradiction. So just like she would often support suffragist causes, at the same time she would make statements like women didn't need to be concerned about voting, and that motherhood and marriage were what's best for women. But then she herself didn't choose either one of those. So I think when looking at her life and all that she was able to accomplish, I think the passing is just one of the many things we have, one of the many contradictions, I would say, of her life. But you do have to wonder, being in her place, how could you? I think that it's easier to look back now and be like, in terms of and possibly be judging, but she lived a very complicated life, definitely, I would say, from beginning to end. And that's what I have. So.
Really, really fascinating presentation and conversation. This is such an interesting story.
Yeah.
And just the contradiction that she must have lived is such a compelling thing to look at. So let's dive into some questions. We have an audience question. Mm-hmm. And the speaker said, "Thank you for this presentation. It is very interesting. My question is, did her siblings have any children?"
Yes, they did. As a matter of fact, I believe most of her siblings had children, and at least one of them, she actually ended up, her younger sister, Teddy, had a son, and that she ended up for a time actually adopting when that said sister had some health issues, I think mental health issues, but health issues, as it were, that were going on. So she, I believe his name was Bobby. So they did have children. I think, which is interesting. So in a way, it's like you wonder if did she choose to not have children because of the passing part? The rest of her siblings did. So I think it may have also been the part that she just in general didn't, since she wasn't married, didn't want to go down that route.
We just had another question come in that says, Bella seemed to be a complex human being, as all humans are. Do you believe that her passing was more about surviving and the survival of her family?
I do. I do think that it was about survive. I think that she was growing up in the midst of it. So part of me wonders, actually, when I, in terms of looking at her history, if there was a time, because she was so very young, so she was born in 1879, that act was passed in 1883. She was 4 years old. You wonder about the experiences that she have. Like, was she raised? I mean, when she was in DC, yes, she was around these Black members of her family, but remember, everybody was more fair skinned. So it makes one wonder, how aware she was of her father's work, how aware she may have been of race. So I always had that question in the back of my mind while learning about her. But I definitely think I think for sure, as she was an adult, hiding the secret and holding on to the fact that, yes, she was passing was definitely for survival, because there's no telling how people would have reacted. And, she supported her family. She helped each of her younger siblings essentially get through school. She contributed to that. From the time she started working. So I think that definitely was a piece. And I think that for her mother, the same way, she was a single mother in New York with 5 kids, and her father, as known as he was, reading about his history, he was not able to steadily hold down work. There was always something that was coming up. So in some ways, I think that was a decision made out of survival and trying to have a better life.
What's really interesting in her case is that she had lived so much of her formative years really up until she was 16, I think, as a Black woman. Although, as you noted, in a lighter complected community or where it was easier to maybe bear up that I sing that long with a Black identity before switching over to that passing choice. How does that really impact our understanding of the choice she made? Was it something that you think was a conflict for her, or just knowing that willingness to go so far, even as to pretend that her father was dead to keep up that story? What does that tell us about what might have been kind of going through her mind and making that choice?
That is such a good question because I did wonder that, and that's part of why I really do wish that. I mean, I'm sure in general, people who like read about her or wanted to write about her wish that she actually had not burned her papers. I think that perhaps there was maybe been some I think she may have been conflicted, and I think that in terms of that may have been part of why she burned her papers, because it's like there would have been this acknowledgement of this is where I'm from and whatnot. One story that was told in the biography of her is, I guess at a certain point she had a maid who she basically, the way she talked about her, she basically described her as almost like a mammy, but she was like a family close to her as a family member. So we get the sense that she was a Black maid, and she stopped communication with one of her friends, one of her guy friends, for a period of time because of the fact she was taking care of this woman while she had gotten sick. And so there was such a familiarity with her, and like, oh, she has been there for me since I was a kid, which again, it was kind of blurry to as to like, okay, who and what relation it was. But I think that there had to have been, like, she grew up, like when they were in DC, it would be not multiple families, but she lived in very close proximity to her extended family, even as a child. So I think that having that ripped away from you as a child, and then you're in a new city where it's just you and your family, I think that definitely is something. That familiarity had to have been trying. And so I do sometimes wonder, like, what did the mothers say to her and her kids, to her and her siblings, in terms of, this is what we're going to do now. These are who you're going to play with. This is the school you're going. Like, I wonder, like, what those conversations may have been like, don't tell anybody about your dad, or don't tell anybody that you're Black. Like, it's all a lot of questions and guessing, I feel like, because she left so few clues, and then her siblings weren't really they didn't really come to this level of prominence as her, so there's not much really I could sort of guess. I would imagine, though, I would imagine there had to have been some sort of conflicting feelings with that, though.
There's another audience question. Do we know if any of her family are alive?
I do not. I am not sure. I know that the one nephew that stayed with her, that she briefly adopted, he died in World War II. So I'm not sure as to what became of the others. Many of her, in terms of like any nieces or nephews, I'm not really sure in terms of what happened with them.
Okay. Going back to what you were just sharing about the role her mother may have played in that decision and the sense of identity between Bella and her siblings, I was reading a publication from the Morgan Library of 2 letters written regarding Bella, and I think you referenced one of them as well. One of those letters shared Bella's background and noted that she was bright, quick to learn, easily influenced, and full of energy and fun, but also explicitly noted, while the trace of Negro blood is noticeable, Belle has always associated intimately with the best class of white girls, and that her mother, quote, wanted to make the girl a true noblewoman. There's also a reference in the letter that I found really fascinating, is the author of that letter said, the mother, of course, is white with good ancestry, and Bella inherits brains and ability. So that just raised so many questions.
Yeah, yes,
With
yes.
us knowing the mother's background, knowing that she was not, of course, white, what does that tell us about her mother and this sense of identity that she crafted for her family, at, really kind of at the expense of her own identity? And was she ashamed of that background, or was it just seen as easier to cast that identity off and make that her identity?
So yeah, yes, that letter was that letter is the one I referenced to. It was interesting to me because I thought to myself, if her mother, she has a trace of Negro blood, but you're saying that her mother is white, wouldn't that be indicating that the father had that? And wouldn't that have been just as frowned upon then, at the time, if she was intermixing? So that was one thought that I had. And then the other, just in terms, the idea, the thought that I get, the idea I get about the mother is she was sort of, I see her in two ways. I see in one way she was trying to like get the best for her children, and so for her, if that meant that at that time she, being treated better meant being passing for white, and people making that assumption, I felt like she was like, I'm going to do that. That's the way I'll go. And because again, the father had a name that was known, like her father, I believe they said, was mentioned by name in W.E.B. Du Bois's Talented Tenth. Like they say that he ran in crowds where people like knew the name. So I think that killing him off, honestly, and pretending that he wasn't there for her was like the best, easiest way to essentially sort of make that distance. And so I think in a sense it was a level of survival and looking out for her kids. It's almost in a sense of a little ruthless. Um, and it does make you wonder, like I feel like I think about many of the stories that I've read about passing, about how people do often, they have to make that cutoff with the family. So it's like, even if they don't want to, they have to for the sake of keeping up this life, for being able to have a better opportunity. So I don't want to necessarily assume that she just, didn't care and wanted to put all that behind her. I feel like she knew once she made that decision, she had to stick with it. And true to that, I'd also read that, while it was frowned upon to pass, in the Black community, that at the same time they would respect that sense and know that people wouldn't, people thought that you were passing, then they would, fall back. I think the only reason that her father got some of the pushback is because they thought that he had tried to pass and was then trying to return to them, which at the time wasn't too kosher. But I think that people, they knew what she was trying to do, and then, and for her and the kids, and just basically were like, well, we don't want to put any scrutiny or put them in harm's way.
A question just came in. Did the father try to have contact with his family?
So he did. He had a very complicated, I would say complicated. Around the time when they divorced, he was trying to get a position he was trying to become, I guess you could say, a consul with the government. And originally he was trying to go, I forget the specific country, but essentially when the mother found out about that, she used her family ties to get a stop put to that. Eventually he was sent to Russia, basically, as I guess a diplomat. So he was in Siberia, and he ended up having a common law. He was in Russia, but it was apparently like somewhere close to Japan, because he ended up having a common law Japanese wife and had children with her. So he did that, and then eventually he did come back to the U.S. and he bounced around. He ended up in Chicago, I think, is where he finally passed away. I think he went to San Francisco before then. He went a lot of places. You don't really get a sense. I know that towards the end of his life, there was a time Belle had mentioned that she alluded to the idea that it was alluded to the fact that she probably went to visit him. I believe that part of the issue was that a distant relative had left part of their inheritance to be split between him and his son, I guess is the males in the family. And he essentially was trying to, establish and say that the son had run off or something like that. He had somehow reached out to her and she went to visit him. But you don't necessarily get a sense of him trying to, I think that there was the sentiment that they left him behind. And I think he, of course, became aware of the fact that they referred to him as no longer being alive. So it seemed almost from all records, it seems as though he basically went off and lived a different life afterwards.
Wow. I mean, the more I think you dive into their story, the more interesting and just
yeah. And I really I felt like I maybe spent a lot of time on that, but I was like, there's so much. There's so much.
One of our audience members made the comment, passing was a tool of her survival and generation correcting. And one of the things that I find so interesting and with the idea of passing, it's come back very much onto the radar of conversation, especially with productions like the recent Rebecca Hall version of Nell Larson's novel, Passing. There's that question of whether passing made or makes one more or less free. Is it a form of liberation or is it really a form of bondage and having to uphold that story? So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that, or if we have any insights into Belle or any of her family's view of that. Did they feel more liberated? Did they ever express senses of feeling like were really bound up by having to maintain that lie?
So I think that overall, I would say that it's not. My personal opinion would be it's not because you have a secret that you are like you don't want anybody to find out. And so you're trapped by that in a sense. But that being said, I think that some of the experiences that she was able to have at that time, one questions if she would have been able to have, been able to do everything that she did and be treated, because yeah, sure, she could have maybe gone to Europe. There were plenty of Black people who did during that time, but like, would she have been, escorted and part of the different crowds that she was a part of if she were not? And you get a sense from some of the correspondence and letters of hers that left that she did. She felt as though, she was essentially living the life, I guess is the best way of sort of describing it. She was, going to theater, she was rubbing shoulders with, all kinds of people in high society. And so you do get the sense for sure that she was enjoying herself amidst everything she was doing. And she really did, even in terms of talking about her social life, she really was passionate about the work she did with this library. Apparently, she taught herself many different languages so that she would be fluent when talking to dealers, and then also being able to read these manuscripts. It was known that some of her friends said that she lived hard in the sense that she would keep a very packed social calendar, but she always was always absorbed in the work that she did, reading these one-of-a-kind manuscripts and reading as much as she could. So I feel as though she did live. I would say she lived a full life, or as full in some capacity. But I think definitely there was still that lingering, I can't be found out aspect to it. Because again, like I said, not just for her, but her siblings, like they were, and in particular, I think for her siblings, because while she didn't get married, all of her siblings did, and they were married to other white people. And so that would have been an added, that would have added a different dimension to what I'm sure they experienced.
Just all of those different dimensions that you're referencing is just, it's so hard to even wrap my mind around how they navigated all of that, and just the fact that they were married and had children, and which is one of the big fears, right, for people who are passing, is that risk that they took in having children. It raises for me that question of, were they just that self-assured that our my parent could do it, so maybe I'm at lower risk, or any of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of it was, she said that she looked more exotic than her siblings. Like she would compare herself to them. So maybe they thought, that they could more easily pass and thought that. But for sure, I think that I can't imagine the anxiety with living like that in particular. That question, that threat.
An audience member just shared, and I want to note and acknowledge as well that one of the audience member who's sharing is another one of our frequent guests, Dr. Tria Allen.
Yay!
Um,
Love Dr.
uh,
Allen.
so she made the comment, it seems like the mom worked very hard to hold this performance together, even if it meant destroying the career options of her ex-husband. This makes me question the context they live within. And that's such a true question. I mean, just the fact that to keep this up, not only pretending that he was dead, but going into those moments of not letting him essentially have a career. Do we know what was kind of at the root of the issues that they were having, or was he as problematic as he was kind of portrayed as, or was that more of um, a separation tactic of like, we're not associated with him because he's not a good person?
Um, that's a very good question. From all records, it seemed so. He traveled a lot while they were married. He was constantly on the road, like I said, working for the race issue, giving lectures, and just traveling in doing different capacities. You don't get the sense. It's not really clear as to whether he was doing that so purposely he could stay away from the family, or if it was because that was just the work that he loved to do, and it happened to take him away from the family. But I think that would have to be, she consistently, not consistently, but throughout their marriage, they had 5 children. I should mention she was pregnant though. She gave birth 7 times. 2 of the children passed when they were very young. So, she was essentially doing that by herself, but he wasn't there, I believe, for at least a few of the births that she had. So I have to imagine that definitely took its toll. And again, it's like it's not clear as to whether he was intentionally trying to not be around, or if it was just one of those cases where work was getting in the way, because I believe when they were married, she was not working. So he was the breadwinner, and she didn't go back until to teaching until after the divorce. So there may have been that pressure he felt to be able to support and sustain his family, especially knowing that his wife came from, a pretty, a family that had at that time, relative means. So that could have been also definitely something in play. There were rumors, it was written that he had a mistress when when he went to New York, he went by himself first, and then she made the decision. They were all going. Maybe part of that was at play. It's really just not that clear. It's just kind of ambiguous. But I would have to imagine that kind of distance has got to take its toll at a certain point.
Well, part of the ambiguity and mystery of Bella's story is the choice that she made to destroy her correspondences, which is such a fascinating choice from someone who was a librarian, a preserver of words, choosing to destroy her own. There was an NPR interview with Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray, who wrote a historical fiction novel called The Personal Librarian about her life. And they questioning why or what she was protecting. She was protecting the legacy of the Morgan Library. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Was she protecting that legacy, or was she protecting her own legacy? And why was destroying her correspondences so central to either choice?
That's a good question. I feel like in a lot of ways she thought that both were that they were one and the same. Like because she was so key in terms of helping that collection grow and oversee, seeing its growth. I think that she didn't want anything that she did or what she was known for to have gotten in the way. I also don't think that necessarily all of the things that were in her correspondence necessarily would have as much talked about race and her, her ancestry, or as much as it may have been some of her affairs and thoughts about other people in society, because there were plenty of when I know on her deathbed, the thing that was said is, she burned her papers, but there were people friends of hers who, refused to burn any papers of the letters she had sent them because, in case they one day wanted to contribute or write a biography on her, even though none of them ended up doing so. Um, so I think that maybe just, some of her thoughts, because she was known to be very blunt and like sarcastic. She was a really lively woman, and she was somebody who spoke her mind. So I think part of it may have been, not wanting to, even in death, like cause errors. But I think in particular, with some of the things that activities she was in, she didn't want to like leave evidence of that, because I do think she did care heavily about, that collection. She took a lot of pride in it, in a sense that was building that was her life's work, essentially, in terms of influencing that. So I think that definitely was probably key in terms of it. And I think she also may have wanted to stay a mystery in some respects, like just burn all aspects of it, let people wonder. But she never would confirm or deny different things. She just let people speculate.
Another audience question came in. What do we know about the mother's family and their backgrounds?
Aside from that they were from Washington, they lived in the Washington, D.C. area. They were at least two generations prior to Civil War. They were basically free people of color in that area. There was a lot of prominence. There's actually been a lot in terms of that was written specifically about the Fleet family. So in terms of like records, in terms of like what people did for occupation, her grandfather, like I mentioned, was a physician. He had received medical training from the American Colonization Society. I think even going further, I didn't bring all the details in terms of it, but I know that some of the free people of color on her mother's side, they had actually, upon being freed and having a trade, they went back and then purchased other family members and whatnot to essentially free others from their family, and went on from there. So there was a good amount of prominence. I wouldn't necessarily say that they wouldn't have been considered rich, but they were, of course, at the time, further well-to-do. Many of them were able to have trades and essentially be able to establish themselves in the city before even slavery had ended. They were known to be more prominent than, I guess, her father's family.
One of the things that I find really interesting with the noting in that 1896 letter of the trace of Negro blood being noticeable in her, it just really makes me question what later in her life actually enabled her then to be accepted as white. Was it a matter of prejudice or willful blindness, or was it more of a willingness to just accept the identity that she gave herself?
I think it probably have been. I think that it could have been part of both. I think that, I mean, in looking at the pictures of her, there is a part of me that's like, okay, how, like, but I'm looking at her through today's eyes, like, how could you not tell that there was something else that was going on there? But at the same time, also, she, I guess you could say like her pedigree, like her taste, the things that she knew. Like I feel like they would not, there was this idea, of course, that of course she couldn't possibly really be Black, because how could a Black person know all that she knows and have the taste that she has, and have this confidence? Like, I think that many of the stereotypes that people then had prevented them from ever thinking that. I think people would guess at her ancestry. I think it wasn't until, like I mentioned, in particular towards the end of her life, that people, which was like 1950, that people were actually like, well, she may have been passing. Because I think that there just wasn't this idea that that was as frequent. But I think by 1950, it had been something, again, Nella Larsen's novel had been out for a while. So I think that more people were aware of the fact that that was taking place. And I also have to mention, like, again, looking at some of the pictures of her, I'm like, I'm sure they had to realize that there was some mixing in there, but I think that they didn't. There was some prejudice, not wanting to accept that could possibly be a reality, and then also just not be. It'd be considered a huge insult to ever ask a white lady if she were passing, because essentially it'd be like accusing them of being Black, and that would be considered disrespect. So that would never be something that people would want to openly actually ask, even if they had suspicion. So it was mostly people who were close to her that would dare sort of speculate or joke with her or try to get her in confidence to reveal that. But I don't think anybody would have dare actually asked. And then I also think, again, like I said, that they just couldn't fathom that could be the case. They just couldn't pinpoint why she looked so exotic, why she had this olive skin and her, thick hair and all of these things. I don't think they could put that together.
You had shared about J.P. Morgan possibly suspecting or knowing that she was not white. And one of the really fascinating questions of passing is that perceived ability to be able to tell what someone's racial identity is, particularly when it comes to Black racial identity. Even with the film Passing and the unique choice that Rebecca Hall made to have two women who are identified as clearly being Black serve in the role of two figures who were capable of passing, it raised that question in so many of the critiques of, well, they are obviously Black. They can't pass. You can look at them and tell. And it really honed in on that question that I think Nell Larsen was even asking in the book of, can you actually just tell what someone is by looking at them? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that perception that just by looking, we could or could not tell both that Bella was Black, or that anyone is passing and identifying them that way.
Yeah, I think it really gets to the idea of how race is like a social construct, because the features that you think that you can clearly tell can sometimes be ascribed. It can be you can't necessarily point out, say, okay, oh yes, that makes you this particular race because of those features. I mean, I think that when I think specifically of Passing, and then with Belle in particular, I think that one of the things that in a way sort of helped her and her family's causes, again, they were, early 20th century New York. They were in a city where you had tons of people from all over the world who were immigrating into New York. It was extremely a diverse area in which they lived in. And in particular, you had people from all over Europe who were coming. And so all these different ethnicities, and you had people who were not familiar with all these different ethnicities necessarily. So I think it would have been a little easier to say, yes, I have this South European ancestry, because they're not honestly going to know. Like the average person, they honestly don't know. Like they're just becoming knowledgeable of these different groups. So I think that it may have been not as easy for them to tell. And I mean, and then true to that, you had a lot of like in particular, like with Italians and other people who were from southern European countries. I think that people they didn't have a clear idea. Like I said, race was something that was really still developing in terms of what they considered a person to be white. There were different over time that started evolving as laws and property and regulations regarding property and housing and owning businesses, as that became more defined, they started becoming very clear cut as to what countries were considered white and which ones were not. So that left a lot of wiggle room, I think, in that time for a person to basically be able to claim being something other than having a Black ancestry. So I think that definitely is something that was to their benefit. Now I don't know, I guess through today, that's why I keep saying through today's eyes, I feel like you can, the joke that my sister and I like to make is you can tell there's something there. Like you don't know what the something is, but you can tell that there is something there in terms of that. Like, I mean, and I think that that's part of why it was smart of Belle not to just say, oh, I'm just white. It was like they specifically added a name and said, oh, we had a Portuguese grandmother. And she would mix truth in with fact, like the fact that her last name was, like, they took Greene. All they did was chop off the ER from her father's name. That was it, and then in terms of like with the Da Costa, it was this idea of, we'll add that part to sort of give credit back to this fictional grandmother, because are people going to really argue with you about something such as that? I think that there was that piece as well.
Well, thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. It's a fascinating way for us to roll over Black History Month into National Women's History Month to talk about someone with such a complicated and just utterly fascinating story like Bella. And it says that there's still so much to unravel in these stories and these different experiences. So thank you for engaging with us, for sharing so much of this story. And I can tell you during your presentation, I went and bought that historical fiction because I have to read more about this person and find out more of this story. Are there other sources that you're aware of or books
about
that
her?
have been published about her that go in? Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I would, I leaned a lot on her. I leaned a lot on the book An Illuminated Life, that was a biography written about her. I feel like the author did a lot. She did a lot of research in terms of getting bits and pieces and scraps of different information. So I leaned heavily on different things such as that. There have been different articles written about her, but I feel like the book In Illuminated Life probably was the one that can give you a better, clearer idea of just her entire life.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. And thank you to our audience for joining in, for asking so many wonderful questions tonight, and really getting into it with this story. We, as always, appreciate the folks that come in, join us, participate, ask questions, and dive into these different stories of the Live Black experience. And we, of course, always encourage you to come back for our next session, come back for all of our sessions and continue participating, learning along with us, and just engaging in these conversations. Dr. Howard, again, thank you so much for this presentation.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
To our audience, we, as always, and to our audience, as we always say, we wish you a wonderful evening. Please come back for our next sessions. And until then, go in grace.